What is going on, gunfighters? Saddle up for another episode of Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about gunfighting the right way, with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. So let's talk about Gucci Glocks. There are seemingly whole gun stores that that's their niche, right? That might not be all they sell, but a big part of what they sell are these Gucci Glocks. You know, fancy, or not even fancy, just different Glocks. Maybe some cheaper, maybe some more expensive, some ridiculously expensive for a Glock, I think. But places with a vibrant gun culture like Boise, like Las Vegas, places like that, they'll have whole niche stores I've seen where that's kind of their shtick, their thing they do is Gucci Glocks. And with the patent on the Gen 3 expired, why not, right? The two big things I have against the Glock are, well, I have a few, but the two main ones are the triggers are horrendous, even by polymer striker-fired standards, and the ergonomics are horrible. So if you get rid of those two qualities and keep the legendary reliability, then yeah, they have something to offer. I think there's a real place for that. I guess first off in this episode, let's talk about modifying your Glock. Now the hard thing, the Glock frames are not modular, that is the firearm. I have no problem if you know what you're doing with filling in the back strap and dremeling that sucker out to make it not feel like you're grabbing a 2x4. To make it feel like something that should actually be grabbed in your hand. And you can do that, again, pretty easily with some kind of epoxy, some kind of filler in the back strap, and a Dremel, giving it a more traditional grip angle. Most of the Gucci Glocks you see come out give it a more traditional 1911-ish style grip angle. And I think that's a good way to go. So you can do that yourself. You run the risk if you've never done it before, or you're really not mechanically inclined of ruining a gun. You might buy a cheaper, let's call it like an airsoft gun or a plastic framed gun that's very similar to a Glock. They make a bunch of copies, and doing it on that first before you do it on your actual Glock. But if you go slow, take your time, you know how to stipple, you know how to remove material with a Dremel. Nothing wrong with doing it yourself, DIYing a good Dremel job and a good stipple job on a Glock. There's nothing wrong with that at all. You can certainly do it. The other way to go if you're building it yourself is getting an aftermarket one. You know, the polymer 80s, they're known for their 80% lowers, which I don't recommend that if it's a go-to fighting handgun. They're fine if you want, you know, that kind of gun. But if it's your go-to carry gun, get the frame that's finished. And 80% polymer lowers, they do make a finished lower. You can just get it and do the paperwork or whatever and have a finished lower that's probably going to be a lot more reliable than you doing it yourself, unless you've done a lot of them. But you can't pay somebody else to do it because that's illegal, somebody that knows what they're doing, so you have to do it. So I would recommend just having it done. If you get into shooting with your gun, which is the reason you're carrying it, right, that's going to be the least of your issues. Just do the paperwork on it. That'd be my advice. If you want one that you do yourself, that's fine. But for a go-to carry gun, get somebody that professionally does it. I'd say the same about the AR-15 lowers. If you want one that you built yourself just to do it, go ahead. If it's going to be your go-to fighting rifle that you're going to trust your life to, get one that a professional did. Anyway, you can get a lower that way. Even if you wanted to use a bunch of the other Glock factory parts, you could buy a, let's say, police trade-in Glock or an older beat-up Glock or something like that, and use the other stuff and just use that polymer 80 frame, or there's a bunch of other ones. I guess I'll name them now. Grey Ghost Precision makes good stuff. The Shadow Systems, they all make their kind of version with better ergonomics, in my opinion, than the actual Glock lower. The Glock receiver, the frame, I guess frame is the proper term, vernacular. They're all better, in my opinion, than the actual Glock is. You can fix the frame that way. The next big thing for me is the trigger. Now, here's where you run into issues. We're talking about legality. Some people really think you should not mess with the triggers on your carry guns. When I was the commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters, part of that being a commander meant writing the policies. And although I didn't like it, one of the policies was you can't modify, no internal modifications of the trigger mechanism of your gun. Because I know what some people would do. And I know that they probably wouldn't know what they were doing. And I don't know that I would want that on the team. So if they were going to get a gun like that, they had to buy it like that. So they had to get a gun with that trigger in it. I would encourage you to maybe look at the same thing if you were looking at a carry gun, a gun you're going to defend your life with, a competition gun, just for fun gun. That's fine. Do whatever you want. But for a carry gun, a life-saving gun, a duty gun, maybe get one that a factory, again, Gray Ghost, Shadow Systems, somebody else already did. ZevTech's another big one. Get one that they've done. That way the liability is on them. You can say, this is their gun. They put this trigger in there. This is not me. I did not modify this gun to make it more deadly or some whatever ridiculous thing that would get said in court, right? You can say, no, this is the way it comes from the manufacturer. It's a good trigger. That's how they make it. They do their specifications. And then the liability is not on you. It's on whoever made the gun. If you made the gun, that liability you take on yourself. But there are a lot of really good triggers. Maybe the best one I have felt is the Timney trigger. The worst one, and I was really disappointed in this, everybody's seemingly been excited about the Shadow Systems Glocks. And I thought, oh, all the things I read about it and seen about it, especially watching people that, in my opinion, have very biased opinions that get them on YouTube or whatever. And I got my hands on one and I thought, oh, this thing's going to be really good. And what's one of the first things I did? I dry fired it, and I went, ugh, not audibly, right? But in my head, I was just wanted to throw up a little bit in my mouth because the trigger on it was horrendous. It wasn't any better to me than a Glock, a factory Glock trigger, going back to that lighter thing. Yeah, it may have been lighter, but it wasn't better. It was still a mushy mess, like dragging a piano down a gravel road. It was just, ugh, just laborious, nasty process. So the Shadow Systems, I'm not saying they're bad guns. I'm saying if you want a better trigger than a Glock, I don't think that's it. I just don't. It's maybe lighter, but better, debatable. The Timney triggers are really good. You might look at ZevTech if you're wanting a really good trigger. You may also look at Gray Ghost Precisions. But that's the two big things for me. There's nothing wrong with a Glock factory barrel. If you want a really nice aftermarket barrel and what I would call the Gucci barrels with like the little oil divots in it or fluting or a threaded barrel, cool, rock on. There's nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of really good options out there on barrels. The Glock factory barrel is one of the last things I would mess with changing. They're really good barrels. But if you want to, that's fine. But for me, if you're going to get a Gucci Glock, the two big things are the ergonomics and the trigger. And most, from what I've seen, have better ergonomics than the actual Glock frame. So any of those win for me in that category. The Gray Ghost, the ZevTech, even the Polymer 80s I really like, and they're not expensive. They have really good ergonomics, and I have never heard anything bad about them. Unless it was somebody that was trying to build it themselves and didn't do it right and it had reliability issues. But the ones that are factory complete Polymer 80 lowers, they're good, they're affordable, they come in a couple of different colors, they have good ergonomics. Probably the way that I would go. But again, any of them pretty much have a better ergonomic profile than the actual Glock, in my opinion. If you want the best ergonomics of the actual Glocks, I would go with the Glock Gen 5 or the really, really early Gen 1s, but those are kind of collectors. But the ones without finger grooves, I can't stand finger grooves. But any of those aftermarket ones. On the triggers, Glock does offer a couple of factory things for their triggers. They do make the 3.5 connector, the 3.5 connector. It's been around a long, long time. Now, they don't recommend that, as far as I know, on the for duty carry. So if you did put one in and you did get in shooting, you'd have to deal with that because they specifically say don't do that. At least I believe that's still the case. It was common for that to be said years ago. I don't know if Glock still does that or if they ever did that. But from what I've heard, that's not approved for duty use. What they will approve is that 3.5 connector with a New York trigger. If you don't know, the trigger takes a bad Glock trigger and makes it even worse. Makes it even harder to shoot. But the New York triggers are a thing. If you combine the New York trigger with a 3.5 trigger bar connector, I think that is approved for duty use, as far as I know. And it does, in my opinion, make the trigger better. Not lighter. Again, lighter is not better, but better. It's more crisp. It's a more predictable, in my opinion, better trigger. One of the other benefits is just the way the stress is put on the New York connectors. That is one of the things that can break on a Glock. Yes, Glocks do break, and the trigger springs is one of the things that can break. The New York trigger, because of the way it works, tends to not break. So if you went that way, you could potentially even increase the reliability of the Glock by giving it that 3.5 connector and the NY1 trigger spring. Anyway, I don't want to get too technical on all the different parts and pieces of a Glock. As you can tell, I've run Glocks a lot. I started competition shooting with a Glock. That was my first issued carry gun as a police officer, a Glock. I carried them a long time, carried them in some nasty places. They are reliable guns. I will give them that. I know the ins and outs of a Glock. I can take them apart, put them back together, and I'm not just talking the basic field stripping. I'm talking about a lot of the small internal parts as well. Some of the other modifications you may consider doing are the maritime spring cups. If you're in a maritime environment, if you live in Phoenix, Arizona, maybe not a big deal, or Las Vegas, Nevada. However, if you are in any kind of maritime environment, the maritime spring cups, you've probably seen videos of people shooting Glocks underwater, super cool. The maritime spring cups allow that firing pin and everything and the water to get out of there, get out of that channel, to not build up that hydraulic pressure. So the maritime spring cups, cheap, easy thing you can do. They're a factory part. You might want to consider doing that. A lot of people, when they're messing with triggers and stuff, they'll put a lighter firing pin spring in there. I would recommend not doing that. That directly correlates with the amount of force that hits the back of that primer. If it's for competition, that's fine. If it doesn't go off, you just tap, rack, bang. But again, if it's a carry gun, I would keep the factory spring in there. They even make heavier springs. You might want to consider putting a heavier spring in there. It's just going to give you that much more positive striking of that firing pin on the back of the primer, the thing that actually makes the gun go bang. One thing I will say about Glock, their QC, their quality control is great, and it's been consistent over the decades. Yeah, they've had some issues with newer models coming out and problems. I totally get that. Every manufacturer does. And again, I don't even particularly like Glock, but I'll give them credit where credit is due. Their QC is phenomenal. It's rare that you find a bad Glock barrel or a bad Glock spring. Now, it happens. I've gotten bad Glock springs right from the factory. I've had Glocks that didn't work right from the factory. However, as far as QC goes, they're really, really good. So my default would be keep the factory part unless there's a good reason not to. So default would be the factory part. Default would be the factory firing pin spring. Their finish on their slides that used to be Tenifer, it's probably something else now from what I hear, the chemicals they use to make the slides. They couldn't do that here in America, so they use something else. But all their finishes on their slides, maybe not impervious to rust, but they're phenomenally slick, smooth, and a really, really good finish. So if you want a Cerakoted Glock, I get it, but I would really look at keeping, at least on the slide, that factory finish is amazing. It's really, really weather resistant. And if you want a Gucci Glock and you want a Cerakoted, burnt bronze, distressed, battle worn, whatever, cool, you do you, but you're doing that for aesthetics. The actual finish on a Glock slide and Glock barrel are some of the most impervious to the elements that I've seen. They're phenomenal. Talking about factory parts, Glocks are known for having bad factory sights. Of all the things, I think they're not that bad. People rag on them for being plastic, but a big chunk of that gun is plastic. So, the factory sights, little pro tip here, at least what I like to do, I like a colored front sight and a black, totally black rear sight. An easy thing to do is just beat that rear sight out with a plastic punch and a little hammer. Beat it out, turn it around, because the front of that sight is black. So I turn it around so that the back of the sight is in the front, and it's completely black. So I have a black and then I have a white dot in the front. That's not a bad sight picture. Also, you can take a small round file, like a jeweler's file, and cut out the rear notch so it's round. And for whatever reason, it seems when you get a proper sight picture, you cut off part of the dot with the rear sight. But you can take a small file, a small round file, with just a couple of passes, it's soft plastic, and cut a circular U-notch in the bottom of that sight so that circle kind of rests in that little circle of the U-notch. That'd be your cheapest option and get okay sights. The factory Glock night sights are not the worst things in the world. Every Glock that I've ever run factory-wise shoots to a 6 o'clock hold, so you have to be aware of that. It means that it shoots above the sights. It's meant so that the bullet impacts above the front sight. That's an old holdover from when a lot of people shooting pistols did bullseye competitions and things, and you got to remember the Glocks came out in the 80s. Anyway, be aware of that. There's a lot of really good aftermarket sights. On sights, that is one of the great things about the Glocks. Again, not a huge fan of Glocks, but I give them credit where credit is due. They have a great sight system in that they're easy for the end user to install if you have the proper tools. If you have the proper tools, that little small wrench for the front sight, it's a very good system. Caution, some of the very early Glocks, some of the ones I encountered as a police officer, they have pressed in front sights. They can be a bit of a chore, but most of the modern ones where they have the little small nut that screws in, it's a phenomenal system, and the rear sight being a simple dovetail, it's a good system. And since Glocks are so ubiquitous, there are so many different kinds of sights, and I've used many over the years. I talked about how to configure the factory sights if you want the best out of those. People rag on those plastic sights, but one of the good things about the black plastic sights is on metal sights, when you carry them and shoot them and practice with them a lot, the edges tend to get worn and they become silver, which makes it hard to shoot precisely with those sights. You have to constantly keep painting them. With the black polymer, if it rubs a little bit, it's still black polymer. So it's not all bad for the black plastic sights. And people will rag on them because they're plastic again, but a big chunk of that gun is plastic. So if you don't like plastic, Glock's probably not the gun for you anyway. That being said, there are better options than the factory sights. They make the Glock night sights. They're okay, especially if you're used to the regular 6 o'clock Glock hold. I like a combat hold. I like the center of the front sight, wherever that dot is. I like that to be where the bullet goes. That's me. I find that more intuitive and easier to shoot faster and more precisely. That's what I like. That being said, I really like the Ameriglow. Ameriglow makes some really good night sights. Again, for this, I like a bright front sight and a completely black rear sight. I don't like, even on night sights, 3-dot sights. If you're shooting fast or in a disoriented manner on your back, rolling around on the ground, things like that, you can get confused with all those dots bouncing around. If you're just standing static on a range, that's one thing. I like a bright front sight, daylight or night, and I like a black rear. Ameriglow makes these. I like them. If you want 3 tritium vials, I would recommend just taking a Sharpie and blacking out the other colors on the back sight and just taking a Q-tip with some alcohol and just getting a little bit off where the glass is so that you can see the tritium at night, but in the day they're all black in the rear. That's my recommendation to you, especially if you want to shoot fast. Anyway, with the night sights, I like those Ameriglows. They're good, they're simple, and the ones that I have on my Glock 17, they have a straight-on combat hold. I like them. With that Glock Gen 5 17, and that's a factory option. They do offer those factory option. I keep that Glock factory stock so that when I do training and go to training classes, and a lot of my students are running a factory Glock, I can just run a factory Glock. Those are factory option sights. They're not Glock made by Glock, but they're an option that Glock offers. Kind of sights, at least a Glock factory option sight. They shoot point of aim, point of impact, at least on my gun with the ammo that I shoot. I routinely can make headshots at 50 yards with those factory iron sights with a Glock with a factory trigger, which is kind of like walking a tightrope in a tornado, but it can be done. The other ones that I really recommend are the TrueGlow, the TFO, Tritium Fiber Optic. These are awesome if you like the good fiber optic sights, but you also want a tritium night sight. These, as I understand it, basically use a tritium vial underneath a fiber optic sight, so they glow in the daytime, they glow in the nighttime. They are good sights. I have these on my other Glock, a Glock 26, one that I carry quite a bit. I use it as my deep concealed carry gun when I am not pocket carrying. So when I want to carry like farther back and I don't want to get observed, I'm going over the wife's relative's house who are not really pro-gun, and I may be rolling on the ground with nieces and nephews, things like that. Also, if I'm doing a plainclothes operation, which I should say when I was, I'm doing the podcast thing now, but when I was professionally gunfighting and doing covert kind of stuff, working plain clothes. Anyway, I have these on a set of those, and I have run these quite a bit over the years. One of my good friends who used to do a lot of competition shooting when I was doing a lot of competition shooting and traveling around doing competition shooting, he really liked these sights. I moved away from Glock, but he stuck with them. He really liked these sights. I really like these sights. Again, they're the Tritium Fiber Optic by TrueGlow. They're really good sights. If you want a sight that just stands out day or night, they are an awesome option. Not that the Ameriglows don't. They have a really good, bright, painted front sight in the day, which is good, but it's not as good as a fiber optic sight. That really glows. So that's another really good option for you there on those sights. Okay, so in talking about tricking out a Glock and Gucci Glocks and all that, if I were doing it, what would I do? And you really got to ask yourself on this, how much are you going to polish? How much time and money and effort are you going to spend polishing fecal matter instead of just going with another platform? Not that it can't be polished. They can be. If you remember, there was an old episode of Mythbusters way back when I had television, whenever Mythbusters was on TV. I mean, they probably do the reruns on TV now, but when Mythbusters was like a new thing, they did an episode where they polished animal droppings, and they actually got them shiny. But how much effort, it's kind of the same thing, right? Yeah, you can do it, but how much effort are you going to put in before you just go to something better? That's kind of where I'm at on these. But if I was going to do it, if I was working for a department or something and they said, you can have the gun that you want, however, it has to take Glock 17 magazines, right? That might be a common thing. Like, we want interchangeability of mags. You got to take something that shoots a Glock 17 mag. You know, if that was the route, if I was going to do this, here's what I would likely do. I was thinking about this driving back from Tampa, picking my wife up from the airport, and I would probably go with an old school, since the Gen 3 are the ones with the expired patents. I'd probably look for a really old Glock 17L. The 17L stands for long slide. If you don't know what that is, look that up. I would look for an old Glock 17L. The more beat up, the better, because I don't really care about that, and it's probably going to save me some money. And I'm going to replace a lot of these springs anyway. They're cheap, and they're the parts that wear out. If you don't know, quick aside on a Glock, a lot of the generations, you're supposed to change the recoil spring every 3,000 rounds, 3,000 to 5,000 rounds. Most people don't, but you're supposed to. So I'm going to replace that anyway. Trigger spring I'm going to replace probably with a factory one or something, or a whole new trigger. But I would look for a Glock 17L. And then I would go to probably the Polymer 80 lower. Not the one that I had to make myself, but the completed, finished Polymer 80 lower. I'd probably get it in brown or OD green, maybe OD green. I'd get the 17 length size, not the 19 length size. At least I think they make that. I know they make the 19 size. I would drop in the Timney trigger. If this was going to be my gun, I would drop in the Timney trigger. I would put in an extra power firing pin spring, and I would put in maritime spring cups. I would put on the AmeriGlow, scratch that. I'd put on suppressor height sights of some kind, probably just plain black, front and rear, because this is a different philosophy of use. I am going to do that, and then I don't like the Glock mounting system for optics anyway. I've dealt with it quite a bit. It seems kind of like a flimsy afterthought. I'm not real confident in the mounting ability on their factory option. So I take this old girl and I'd have her cut into a convertible. And I'd have it direct cut for a Trijicon RMR. There are a lot of good optics out there. I like the Trijicons that don't tank batteries. I don't like trusting my life to things with batteries. I'd get it direct cut so I could mount it directly with 2 big beefy screws. Not the tiny little screws that seem to come on the Glock mounting system. I'd get 2 big beefy screws and screw that optic directly down onto the slide, and I get co-witness suppressor height black iron sights. I like backup iron sights, and I want them black so they don't distract from the primary optic on there. I would test fire it, see how accurate it is. Now, Glocks are not known for accuracy. I may end up having to go with an aftermarket barrel and a TR Graham lockup lug. I think those really do work and help improve accuracy. I'd probably get one of those. They're not that expensive. And if it still didn't shoot great, I'd probably get an aftermarket barrel. Hopefully by that point it would shoot halfway decent. I would get a bunch of ammo and I would run a ton of ammo through it. Not literally a ton, but I would run a lot of ammo through it, and I would make sure it was reliable. I would make sure it functioned well. I would make sure that it shot point of aim, point of impact. And that probably would be how I would get my Franken Glock or my Gucci Glock. I'd leave the factory finish on the slide. I think it's a great one. If I was sticking with the factory barrel, I'd leave the factory finish on the barrel. And the polymer doesn't really matter. I'd get it in green, but you don't really have to paint them because they're that color anyway. Direct mount RMR, Timney trigger, maritime spring cups, extra power firing pin spring, which with that configuration, extra power firing pin spring and the Timney trigger is probably going to give me a good trigger. Not a crazy light trigger, not a speed shooting trigger. Not something I would run for Steel Challenge, but it's going to give me a good trigger. If I'm carrying not in the pocket, I generally carry on my belt. So the length of the barrel doesn't really matter to me. You get a lot of ballistic advantage with a longer barrel. They also, the 17Ls, the 34s, 35s, they tend to recoil better. I like that. I would go that route. If I had to go like the 19 route, that's fine. I would just do the same thing with a 19 slide or a 17 slide. I guess you could make a baby version of like I guess you'd call it a 19L. You could make it with a 17 length slide and a 19 length frame. That'd be a good way to go. That wouldn't be bad. I would only go with a 19 length slide if I absolutely had to. You just give up a little bit of ballistic advantage when you go to the shorter barrel. You lose velocity, you lose power. I would rather have the longer barrel, especially, like I said, I carry on my belt with the pistol oriented with the barrel down, so what difference does it make how long the barrel is? It seems like the one place where it doesn't matter that I trim off size, and the most important as far as ballistics go, so why would I trim that off? But anyway, that's just me. Those are my thoughts on Gucci Glocks, Franken Glocks, whatever you want to call them. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode of Gunfighter Life. Gonna try something different here. I'm gonna put in the tactical verse of the day, hopefully more important to you than the actual episode, and then I'll put in the bio at the end, just to try something new. Feedback is appreciated at goodshepherdtraining.com. The tactical verse of the day. Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? When Jesus heard that, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." With that, man, I want to say thanks for listening. I'm going to plug in the bio and wish you a blessed day. So, who am I? Who is this person talking to you from across the internet? Why should you listen? First and foremost, I am a Christian, a servant of God, and a follower of Jesus Christ. God has blessed me to do many things in my life, for I could do nothing apart from Him. U.S. Marine Corps combat veteran, did a couple of tours in Iraq. As an assaultman after my combat tours, I was an urban warfare instructor for the Marine Corps under Mojave Viper. Also served in the U.S. Army, both full-time and part-time National Guard. Also did several years in law enforcement. LAPD, I worked regular assignments and more specialized assignments. Been a private contractor for a 3-letter government agency. That's all I'll say about that. Been blessed to be a state rifle and pistol champion. And West Coast Regional Rifle Champion. Won more shooting competitions with the talent that God's given me than I can actually remember. Was blessed to be the commander of a tactical team in a large metropolitan area. Our primary job, the reason we primarily existed, was to stop active shooters. I got the opportunity to head up and be the commander of that team. I grew up around guns, hunting and shooting and competing at a very early age. Been blessed to hunt all over this beautiful country, from whitetail on the East Coast to mule deer on the West Coast, and bear and elk and all manner of things. I've even been a professional big game hunter and guide. But again, most importantly, I'm a Christian. And I am your host, Michael Milito. Welcome to the podcast.